Back now on America's Forum, it's been a part of the national conversation for about a week now, the Iraq helicopter story that Brian Williams misremembers. Turns out it was part of what many call his negative coverage of General David Petraeus at the time. Brian Williams went on to slam General Petraeus for admitting he wasn't sure if the Iraq war had made Americans safer. And Brian Williams quoted his colleague Chris Matthews, who asked, quote, "Can you imagine Eisenhower saying the same thing?" Let's get back to coverage and conversation as we continue with our co-host this hour, Pete Hoekstra, and we welcome in Colonel Derek Harvey, a former advisor to General Petraeus, who Skypes in this morning from Tampa. And Colonel, in the role that you enjoyed with General Petraeus, what do you make of the Brian Williams story and his past coverage of your former boss?
Well, I think the story about Brian is unfortunate, but I think it highlights, one of the challenges we've always had in dealing with getting accurate reporting and truthful reporting out to the American public. A U.S. military leader like General Petraeus has to walk a fine line. It's very important to communicate what is going on, and he needs to be circumspect about making larger statements that are outside his purview. And I think Brian Williams, tried to distort much of what General Petraeus meant and what his role was by impugning his character and his perspective.
And mindful of that, Colonel, as we move forward now, do you think in future conflicts there are going to be efforts not to embed reporters, but to isolate reporters from the battlefield? Or in the here and now with the technology at our fingertips, is that an impossible mission?
Well, JD, I think it's just very important that we embed and that we have as much transparency as we absolutely can by providing reporters, whether they're from the New York Times or Al Jazeera, access to what we're thinking, what we're seeing, and why we see the battlefield and the dynamics on the ground the way we do. I think that helps inform the American public and American leaders in a way that they might not be getting normally through, reporting coming through normal channels. More information is always better as long as we protect sources and methods and we make sure that there's no implication for current operations on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting analysis. One of my first trips to Iraq, I flew with General Petraeus, General Odinero. They gave us the briefing. The challenge will be, as you said, how do you keep the information accurate, recognizing that so many reporters now have an agenda which goes well beyond reporting the news. They have a point of view.
Well, if I may, I think that's a challenge. The point of view is something that we need to keep in mind. I think General McChrystal's staff did him a great disservice by bringing in a person from Rolling Stone that had a clear point of view. On the other hand, there are very well-respected reporters from the Washington Post, New York Times, and others that have done a very good job, in our view, of communicating what's going on, addressing the nuance and complexities, and getting it about right from our view.
About a minute and a half remains, Colonel, and post 9/11, there were some in the mainstream media, specifically the alphabet networks, who decried the notion of any presenters wearing an American flag pin on their lapel, saying, we have to report this, and this is a paraphrase, but beyond our interest as American citizens, really to the world's agenda. Has the press, quote, internationalized apart from the national interest post-World War II?
Well, I don't see an issue with someone wearing the American flag. It should not affect their judgment and their ability to communicate what is going on. As long as reporters are reporting the facts, are objective, provide a narrative that is nuanced and explainable, then that should be fine. It's when they get an agenda and they try to prioritize an ideological perspective in their reporting that we have a real problem.
You got 20 seconds left. How do you actually go through and prioritize and select which newsmakers or reporters you will allow in? How do you do the screening?
Well, I'm not very familiar with how that is done. I know that the public affairs staffs at commands and in the Pentagon are very good at doing that. They talk to us about who these people are, what they have reported, and they leave the ultimate judgment to the commanders about the type of access that is given. Sometimes you bring them in much closer into your thinking, and other times they're just getting the normal group reporting.
I got to let loose with my thinking because time's up for this segment. We'll continue the conversation after this.
In Obama's world, he is, as you said, he's got to be an apologist for Islam. And then he lies to the American people about Islam. Islam is not a religion of peace unless you read the Quran, and peace comes after they've conquered the world and everybody submits to Allah.
Former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay here on Newsmax TV earlier, essentially saying that our president's an apologist for Islam. Mr. DeLay's candid comments in response to the president's comparison of ISIS today with what transpired in the Crusades almost 1,000 years ago. Another former colleague of mine, Pete Hoekstra, continues along with us as we in turn continue the conversation with Colonel Derek Harvey. Colonel, as you hear what Tom DeLay had to say, what was your personal evaluation of the president's prayer breakfast comments?
Well, I was very disturbed by those comments, and I think they were inappropriate given the time and place we are with this conflict we have in the Middle East. And it fed right into a narrative that ISIS, the Islamic State, is going to take advantage of those comments and turn those statements around to their advantage in their propaganda war.
Colonel, who is the enemy in ISIS? Who's the enemy in radical Islam?
Well, the enemy is clearly a hardcore Islamic-motivated group of leaders across the region of the middle, primarily the Arab countries in the Middle East. And they are taking a great advantage of an environment of disorder, dissatisfaction, frustration that is complicated by a whole range of social and political issues. Unfortunately, the mobilizing element is an Islamic base, and it's a Salafist Takfiri, what I call an annihilationist agenda that is using Islam in this way.
Colonel and Pete, Bob Woodward of the Washington Post made some comments on this administration's foreign policy that really are reverberating. Let's listen, and then, Colonel, we'll get your reaction.
There's no strategy. They have not sat down and said, this is where we want to go, and this is how we want to do it. And the measure of that, when you get in the weeds here, people from the White House are micromanaging the tactical situation on a daily and weekly basis. That's not their job.
With about 2 minutes remaining, Colonel, do you agree with Bob Woodward that there is no strategy?
Well, I think that, he's right, that, if you really dug into it, there is not a strategy, not a coherent strategy, not a strategy that is aligned with American interests and with supporting, our allies and our partners in the region. And also the humanitarian interests that we have in that part of the world. They are very tactically oriented and looking at most things through a political prism. And I think their strategy is really based on an ideology that is driven by a disaffection towards American historical presence in the region and an apologist agenda on one hand, and on another hand, the idea that America just should not have as large a role as it's had in the past, and that America has probably been more a part of the problem than a good role model for the world.
The president supposedly today is going to announce his authorization of use of military force. I think this is the opportunity for the president and Congress to actually lay out our strategy. Colonel, what are you expecting? What would you want to see in this AUMF from the president as it goes through Congress? What's the outcome you would want to see?
About 40 seconds to answer it, Colonel.
I would like a set of authorities that allows the military as well as the CIA and other elements to be able to have the authorities to take action against the Islamic State under a set of rules and procedures that don't tie their hands, but give them a great deal of liberty to take action to strike ISIS wherever they are at. But I think there should be a time horizon.
Geographically, how big would that be?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Only about 10
Yeah,
seconds left.
geographically, does it include Nigeria, Libya, and those places?
It would go to wherever they're at, into Asia and into Africa also.
And while you expand the boundaries, sadly, there's a temporal boundary on our discussion, a fancy way of saying we're out of time. There's more on America's Forum coming up.